Mary Safford's yearning began under an open sky. As a girl, she would struggle to climb up onto a tree stump at her home in Hamilton, Illinois, where she would preach to her family. Little did she or her family know how much this would shape her life. Mary was born in late 1851, when the rules prescribed for women were clear and the chains around what they could do were tight. Mary's parents didn't discourage her from preaching. Her father was a liberal heretic, and her mother was confident that Mary would grow up and do what women were supposed to do at church: work in the kitchen and pray in the pews, as expected of a true Christian woman at the time. Yet Mary was destined to challenge gender norms. In her early years, Mary likely heard stories of the first female ministers to be ordained. First, there was Antoinette Brown, ordained by a Congregationalist church when Mary was 2. 10 years later, the Universalists ordained the first woman as a denomination, Olympia Brown. And when Mary was 20, the Unitarians caught up by ordaining Cecilia Burley. Antoinette, Olympia, Cecilia, they were like the girl in the field, listening to a calling, a yearning, and answering it. As hard as it must have been for all of them, these women provided the first cracks in the chain surrounding Mary's life. And even while Mary's mother was trying to teach her daughter to be proper, her father was introducing his children to radical and disruptive ideas. In Prophetic Sisterhood, Cynthia Tucker describes Stephen Safford as a farmer and teacher who had become so outspoken in his defense of radical notions like biblical fallibility, abolition, and the new Darwin theory, that he was repeatedly called before his church to justify them. After his death, when Mary was only 9, she discovered his library and the people who had stirred him and most shaped his heresies. When he died, Mary's mother was left running the family farm and caring for all of her children, and the nation was on the brink of civil war. Mary saw she had a mother who was a strong, capable woman who was able to manage the family farm and finances without a man in her life. In her childhood, Mary made friends with a neighbor girl, Eleanor Gordon. Eleanor's family also lived on a farm, but her family struggled financially. The two girls spent a great deal of time under an apple tree on the Gordon farm and talked about their lives. When they were about 17 years old, Mary's mother agreed to send her to college at Iowa State. Eleanor's mother gathered enough money to send her to the same school, but she could only afford tuition for a year. Mary and Eleanor both returned home after that first year because Mary's sister and mother had fallen ill. Disappointed, but not deterred, these young women decided they were going to get a college education anyway, and they worked hard to study the equivalent of a college education while at home taking care of their families. They exposed themselves to many writings and thinkers of the time, including George Eliot's book, Middlemarch. The main character marries, as a proper woman must, and she is hoping to be included in her husband's life and work, but gets shut out instead. Mary and Eleanor decided they didn't have to sacrifice any of their ambitions to husbands. And in 1871, when they were 20, they pledged they would spend their lives serving the world as a team. This was a huge decision in 1871. Just a couple of years earlier, Louise May Alcott had written the book Little Women. And she seemed unable to make her character Jo the literary spinster she wanted her to be. How many of you have read the book? Several. And how many of you have seen the movie that recently came out? Is that the same people? So several of you know the basic story. I won't give away much, but if you haven't seen it or read it and don't want spoilers, now's the time to plug your ears. And you should enjoy that because you do not often hear a minister saying, plug your ears. Little Women is about a family of 5 girls, and the main character is Jo, who is much like the book's author and spends her life writing. She is something of a tomboy and rejects the advances of the men around her. Louisa wanted to leave the character Jo unmarried, like Louisa herself, but so many people insisted she married Jo off to Lori, a childhood friend, or as someone that she says, I didn't dare refuse, and out of perversity went and made a funny match for her. Louisa married Jo off to someone that many felt was unsuited for her. Louisa, like Mary, Eleanor, and many other women, was struggling to carve a path that didn't exist at the time, one where women could live and support themselves without having to look at marriage as an expectation and survival strategy. In an 1883 interview, Alcott said, I am more than half persuaded that I am a man's soul, put by some freak of nature into a woman's body, because I have fallen in love in my life with so many pretty girls, and never once the least bit with a man. Women, openly loving women, wasn't something many people had language for, and it certainly couldn't have appeared in Alcott's book. The closest she was able to get was an unsuitable match for her main character. I like to think that Mary and Eleanor may have encountered Alcott's book and drawn their own conclusions from it. Their decision not to marry but to spend their lives together serving the world was incredible and brave, especially in a time where marriage was almost certainly an economic proposition for women. By their early 20s, Eleanor had been teaching for several years and had become an assistant principal, and Mary discerned a call to be a Unitarian minister. So the young women started Hawthorne Literary Society, which allowed them to host discussions, to try out ideas in writing and speaking, and invite speakers to come and talk to both women and men about all manner of things. A favored speaker of theirs was Reverend Oscar Clute, a Unitarian minister who often spoke of evolution, that radical Darwin theory, and who, over the course of several visits, encouraged the women to start their own church. By 1879, when our congregation was just 14 years old, Mary and Eleanor were planning services for a church in their hometown of Hamilton, Illinois, and drawing between 150 and 200 people to services. In addition to church services, they had social gatherings, evening lectures, and even plays at the church. The two women quickly came to the attention of Jenkin Lloyd Jones, who was the Unitarians' Western Secretary, which means he was kind of a missionary for this area of the country. He sort of oversaw the churches and helped them get started or get ministers. He was a strong supporter of female ministers, possibly largely because male ministers on the East Coast at the time, who were paid decently well, could not be convinced to be moved to what was considered the border of civilization. But this provided a great opportunity for women clergy. Jenkin Lloyd Jones recruited Mary and Eleanor to go to Humboldt, Iowa, to a congregation that had been unable to find or keep a minister. It was also a place that was looking for a principal for their school. Eleanor wrote in her diary, We had decided 4 years before to work together, and now the opportunity had come for establishing our home. In June of 1880, 27 years after the first female was ordained, Mary's ordination was a simple service at the Humboldt Church. Cordelia Cole, a feminist lecturer, gave the charge to Mary, and she spoke about the idea that women had special attributes to bring to ministry. Not just that they were not men. She was proud of the differences and told Mary the difference between her and men would account for her successes. And she cautioned her not to diminish herself by just accepting the male way of doing things as a model for her own success, not to suppress or conceal her unique capabilities out of some sense of female weakness or insufficiency. She encouraged Safford to live into who she was, to break the chains on her life. Cole told Safford that by answering a call to ministry, she proved that it wasn't limited to a particular sex or race. Cordelia Cole also reminded Mary Safford not to neglect reaching new offspring, especially daughters, to carry the ministry forward. While in Humboldt, Safford and Gordon lived into this charge. They took in 4 teenage girls who did something of an apprenticeship with them. One of the girls, Mary Colson, said she and the other girls were called from birth to be ministers. Safford believed that true religion must first of all be free religion, free from irrational dogma that discouraged personal growth. She held that the human soul would evolve, not in solitude, but through community. People would make their common tasks divine by doing them in the spirit of love and helpfulness. Throughout her many years of ministry, she worked to help her congregations be the kind of religious communities in which individuals could evolve together in the spirit of love and helpfulness. Several years later, Eleanor Gordon was also ordained. And with Mary and several other women ministers, they formed the Iowa Sisterhood that covered several states in the Midwest. The women supported one another and their congregations by sharing pulpits. They also set up new congregations and treated members like families in the ways that congregations on the East Coast did not. Mary and Eleanor grew up in a United States that had roles even more rigidly defined for women than we do now. Yet when we look at any time in history, we can find people who challenge restrictive roles, such as these women who struggled to live lives of integrity and break the chains that society put on their lives. This has been the goal of feminists, to free women from the chains that bind them. Expanding the range of professions available to women allowed them to make different choices in their lives, including the choice not to get married or to marry for love, rather than financial protection. And here's what's easy to forget. When people live their lives with integrity, it ripples out. It touches others. Our lives can show others new possibilities for their own lives. When we link particular roles and ways of being to women, we also bind men. We see this when men insult each other by referencing women. You throw like a girl. It's not intended as a compliment. We put chains on men and boys when we tell them they can't be sensitive or have long hair or like the color pink, when we end up surprised that they're kindergarten teachers or nurses or ballet dancers, and the list goes on. People who live lives of integrity, such as Mary Safford and the Sharps, who we discussed last week, teach us more about what is possible when we break the chains that bind us in our lives. Mary suffered to break free from the restrictive roles of her time. She and Eleanor were chronically underpaid, and Mary worked to the point of exhaustion and damage to her own health. That's the harm we do when we force people to fight through barriers just to be themselves, just to follow their call, just to follow their yearning. So, what chains do we have here and now? Is there anything in our society that stops us from living lives of integrity? Is there anything that stops us from listening to our calling and being the people we were meant to be? My beloved spiritual companions, Reverend Mary Safford, Reverend Eleanor Gordon, Reverend Antoinette Brown, and Reverend Olympia Brown led the way, opening ordained ministry to women, including me. They and so many more have struggled to break the chains with which we bind and restrict one another. May we follow their example by freeing ourselves and others from that which keeps us from our call today. And may we support one another on the journey. Blessed be. Amen.